Multiple attacks have occurred in or around Paris.
IS, världens mest fruktade terrorgrupp. Det här är historien om varifrån de kommer.
We created chaos, we abandoned that chaos, we created ISIS.
Om 10 års våldsamma strider.
The invasion toppled the government, but Zarqawi ripped the country in half.
These people are really prepared to fight the world and demonstrate that in an act of horrific violence.
Och om 2 presidenters misslyckanden.
The United States government made decisions that seemed to make sense at the time, but without those series of decisions, there would be no ISIS.
Wave of violence in Baghdad.
I Dokument utifrån ikväll, så skapades IS.
De dök upp i början av 2014 och verkade komma från ingenstans. IS började erövra viktiga landområden i Irak.
The jolting gong was when they swept into western Iraq and took control of a third of western Iraq. The banks that were robbed and stripped, the assets that were stripped in that entire area was huge. And that was, as I said, the jolting gong that said, wait a minute, how could this happen?
Deep concern about ISIS pushing into Baghdad.
ISIS has been seizing territory in Iraq and Syria.
They were able to swiftly take over huge areas of Iraq. It was shocking how the army didn't even fight, didn't even put a fight.
And taking over Mosul, the second largest city.
I think Washington was stunned when the second largest city in Iraq, a city of 2 million people, fell in a day to a terrorist organization that we had not imagined was in the first order of terrorist organizations.
Men IS var inte en ny organisation. De hade fört krig i över 10 år, ända sedan den amerikanska invasionen av Irak. De hade använt sig av halshuggningar, självmordsbombningar och massmord för att genomföra sin plan. En plan som hade formats och iscensatts av den här mannen, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, grundaren av IS. IS hemliga historia började avslöjas på CIA efter 11 september-attackerna 2001. Abu Musab al-Zarqawis namn blev hett.
I was an analyst working on the team that was charged with evaluating whether or not Al-Qaeda and Iraq had conspired together to conduct 9/11 attacks.
Analytikern Neide Bacchus fick i uppdrag att ta reda på så mycket som möjligt om Zarqawi.
On the team, as an analyst, the big question was whether or not Zarqawi was part of Al-Qaeda at the time.
Bacchus började med Zarqawis uppväxt.
Zarqawi grew up in Zarqa, Jordan, which was also near a Palestinian refugee camp. He was a tough kid in a tough neighborhood.
Han var fattig och arg och började tidigt begå brott.
He was a thug. He was in and out of prison. He was a petty criminal. It was rumored that he had worked as a pimp.
He was into drugs. He was into tattoos. His friends in Zarqa used to call him the Green Man because of all the tattoos that he had on his body.
I fängelset genomgick Zarqawi en förvandling.
In this prison, Al-Jafar prison, they allowed him to share cell block with other radical fighters or people who wanted to launch jihad.
In prison, he really came into his own because he managed to dominate the other prisoners. He managed to establish himself as a leader. He took his religion more and more seriously.
Zarqawi at the time was the muscle of the movement in jail, and he roughed a lot of people up during his time in jail.
Den nyfrälste Zarqawi betraktade sina egna tatueringar som synd. Ett rakblad smugglades in i fängelset.
It was brutal. He had them actually, the skin taken off.
It's like he's shedding his old life, and this tattoo was a reminder of who he was, and he had to get rid of that to almost purify himself.
Efter 5 år frigavs Zarqawi.
Zarqawi became a leader among the jihadists in prison and came out of prison in Jordan. A jihadist firebrand had reimagined himself as a mujahid or holy warrior dedicated to the establishment of the Islamic Empire.
I sin strävan efter att bli en helig krigare lämnade han Jordanien. CIA spårade honom till Kandahar i Afghanistan. Zarqawi hoppades på att få träffa Osama bin Laden.
When he does go to Kandahar to try to meet with bin Laden, he's rejected. At this point, Zarqawi is so low on the totem pole as to something that was just beneath him.
Neither Osama bin Laden nor his deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, were terribly impressed with him. He seemed and acted like a thug. He was not very sophisticated. In fact, they considered him a rather poor recruit to al-Qaida.
Zarqawi lämnade Kandahar men var fortfarande inställd på jihad och att visa att bin Laden hade haft fel. 2002 såg han sin chans när USA slog fast att Saddam Hussein måste bort. Zarqawi sökte sig till ett terroristläger i norra Irak. Då reagerade CIA. Fallet delegerades till Sam Faddis som ledde en specialstyrka.
Headquarters is extremely interested. I mean, the number one time-sensitive priority as of June 02, when I left headquarters, was go collect on this Islamic extremist enclave along the Iran-Iraq border.
Det dröjde inte länge innan Faddis hade hittat Zarqawi.
We literally had guys that were working for us that were inside the camp. They're working on chemical and biological weapons. They were doing a lot of work with cyanide-based things.
Det hotet kunde CIA inte bortse ifrån om amerikanska trupper skulle invadera Irak.
If we took Saddam out, Zarqawi was going to cause a lot of problems. He was someone who we would have wanted dead if we had the opportunity and the wherewithal to do it.
Sam Faddis hade en plan för att göra det.
I mean, a handful of aircraft tomorrow with the specificity that we have in their locations will end this threat and we will finish these guys.
This seemed like the perfect moment. We know where they are, we know what they're up to. This seemed like the right time to target them and to go after them.
Anfallsplanen skickades från CIA till Vita huset. Men USA var inriktat på Saddam Hussein och president Bush avråddes från att anfalla Zarqawi.
I remember there were discussions about attacking various camps that we thought bad guys were hanging out in. And I think the one you're referring to, we made a judgment that let's not start the war before we're ready.
När beslutet nådde CIA väckte det stark frustration.
Oh, I couldn't believe it. We have a prime opportunity to take out a jihadist that we know poses a threat to our allies, in addition to American forces once they invade.
There was nobody on that team who felt like Washington had made the right decision. There's another country getting up, ready to go up in flames. We're giving them time and space. This will turn out very badly. We need to get rid of them right now.
Men vicepresident Dick Cheney hade en helt ny plan. Han ville utnyttja Zarqawi för att sammankoppla bin Laden och Saddam Hussein och därmed motivera en invasion.
Vice President Cheney came to the CIA asking lots of questions. He wanted to know, not only is there a connection between Saddam Hussein and bin Laden, but we want there to be a connection between the two.
På CIA kände man inte till någon sån koppling.
No, never. We never found any indication that Zarqawi was in Baghdad working for Saddam or linked up with Saddam.
Dick Cheney argumenterade emot.
It was pretty intense. We were lined up on one side of the table. Vice President Cheney and Scooter Libby were on the other side, and they walked in with a lot of questions and being very skeptical as to the intelligence that we had been gathering up till that point.
Cheney verkade vilja att Zarqawi skulle vara en länk mellan Saddam Hussein och Osama bin Laden.
The Vice President's frustrated. His questions are all about Zarqawi, his connection to Saddam, and whether or not they had discussed 9/11, and if Saddam had participated.
Cheney var missnöjd med de svar han fick.
We tried to explain over and over again that it would be impossible for him, logically, to be working with Saddam.
There was no connection between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein in Iraq that we could find. And Zarqawi's the kind of guy Saddam would kill without a moment's thought.
And the response to that was met with skepticism, lots of questions, and a lot more frustration.
Men i Vita huset kasserade man inte Cheneys plan. Den dök upp igen när Colin Powell skulle hålla tal i FN och söka världssamfundets stöd för krig.
The speech supposedly had been prepared in the White House and the NSC. But when we were given what had been prepared, it was totally inadequate and we couldn't track anything in it. And when I asked Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor, where did this come from? It turns out the Vice President's office had written it.
Powell bad CIA att granska talet.
We had a copy of the speech that was sent over from the White House that Powell was preparing, and one of our senior analysts was working on it, editing, working on the language to ensure that it reflected our analysis.
The speech that will be heard round the world at the Security Council.
Powell will try to make the link between Iraq and al-Qaeda.
Några dagar senare anlände Powell till FN.
We have come to another critical moment on the way to a new war with Iraq.
Walking into that room is always a daunting experience, but I had been there before. And we had projectors and all sorts of technology to help us make the case.
This chamber at the United Nations today, the Secretary of State there in the center of attention, Secretary of State Colin Powell and George Tenet, the director of the CIA.
I think he was very nervous. Powell doesn't like to read speeches. He likes to have a few note cards and then do his Powell thing. But this one, he read from the text, every word.
My purpose today is to provide you with additional information.
Nader Bacchus lyssnade noga för att höra vad Powell skulle säga om Zarqawi, bin Laden och Saddam Hussein.
We're sitting in our room at CTC watching the television with a copy of the speech in our hand.
What I want to bring to your attention today is the potentially much more sinister nexus between Iraq and the al-Qaeda terrorist network.
When he got to our portion, it went off our script fairly quickly. And we were looking around at each other saying, well, where is he at? Where's he at? We're flipping through pages. And so, right away we could tell that this wasn't reflecting the language that we had used.
Zarqawi blev ett bevis för kopplingen mellan bin Laden och Saddam Hussein.
Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda lieutenants.
I drew conclusions and language we would not use. So we were very, very, very careful about describing the relationship as we saw it, and it seemed to overinflate and not reflect our analysis.
How did that happen, Nader?
Within the process of how it went, where it went back to the White House and who worked on it after that, I don't know how it was changed or by who.
Powell säger att talet var godkänt av CIA-chefen George Tenet, men han minns inte detaljerna.
I don't remember. Zarqawi was not anything uppermost in my mind. It was not a significant part of the speech for me. It was almost a passing reference.
Men det var mycket mer än så. 7 minuter av talet ägnades åt Zarqawi. Namnet nämndes 21 gånger. Powell gav en felaktig bild av Zarqawi inför hela världen.
From his terrorist network in Iraq, Zarqawi can direct his network in the Middle East and beyond.
I can't even imagine what that did for Zarqawi's ego. To be, here he is, his name is spoken at the UN. Now he's showing bin Laden and al-Qaeda who he really is. right? He's become this iconic person without ever really doing anything.
Några dagar efter talet försvann Zarqawi.
Rapid series of 40 explosions lit up Baghdad in the early morning hours.
Officials have been using the term shock and awe to describe the
Zarqawi iakttog USAs så kallade chockkrigföring och när ockupationen hade inletts väntade han på rätt tillfälle. Det dröjde inte länge innan president Bushs man i Irak, Paul Bremer, gav Zarqawi en sån chans.
And those who were on high before, in particular the Baathists, who used their power to repress the Iraqi people, will be removed from office.
Han gav order om att upplösa den irakiska armén.
You had something on the order of 250,000 Iraqi men, military age, all trained in using weapons. Suddenly they were all out of a job.
Saddam Hussein och hans sunnistyrda armé tillintetgjordes.
The army was the central instrument of Saddam's repression of the Kurds and the Shia. I think the decision not to recall Saddam's army from a political point of view is the single most important correct decision that we made in the 14 months we were there.
Men de amerikanska marktrupperna märkte följderna av beslutet.
The effect, frankly, was devastating. I think that's where the seeds of what became the Sunni insurgency were largely planted.
We had, long lines of soldiers demanding money, demanding to be rehired. There was that whole sense of, defeated militaries should be treated with respect. And that's not what happened.
Week after week after week, the big demonstrations got larger and larger. There was enormous concern because the demonstrations were out of hand. There were actually killings.
They feel like they're going to go by the wayside, that they're going to be not only the minority population, but treated as if they don't matter. So they were easy targets for Zarqawi to recruit.
Det var i det läget Abu Musab Zarqawi såg sin chans. Under veckorna som följde inleddes upproret.
When these sorts of attacks began, nobody was quite clear, I think, where they were coming from, who was behind them, and how sustainable they were.
There has been another spasm of violence in Iraq.
Killed at least 5 Iraqis in the center.
I Washington sa man att allt var under kontroll.
There's an absence of authority, a vacuum of authority for most people.
I picked up a newspaper today, and I couldn't believe it. I read 8 headlines that talked about chaos, violence, unrest, and it just was henny penny, the sky is falling. I've never seen anything like it. It's just unbelievable how people can take that away from what is happening in that country.
Willful denial is one way of putting it. I mean, I remember, thinking at the beginning, this is really, really strange. It's one thing to analyze the situation and then spin it. It's another thing to then start to believe your spin.
Bombattentaten blev allt värre.
A massive explosion at the Jordanian embassy.
Mayhem in Baghdad.
Terrorists exploded a truck outside the compound.
This Iraqi runs in, and I said, "What happened?" And he said it was hit by a suicide bomber. I think that was the first one. To think that after that there would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of suicide bombers, thousands even. It's amazing.
Det var Zarqawis första stora bombattentat. Och knappt 2 veckor senare drabbades FNs högkvarter i Bagdad.
Zarqawi had a strategy. He's just trying to leave it so that it's only the United States military left and it's a black and white conflict. And this will enable him then to rally considerably more support to himself and to his cause.
40 people have died today in a series.
The immediate effect of that was the UN left and all the NGOs were gone within a few weeks, all of them.
And so it essentially left the Americans alone. That was it. It's just you. It turned Baghdad into a kind of this eerie, militarized ghost town.
Baghdad, a U.S. vehicle was on patrol when it came under attack.
Violence has returned with the vengeance. Last night, two more
Exploded
soldiers
in
killed
violence today. The most deadly was a car bombing that killed at least 11 people.
I Washington granskades bombningarna av CIA. George W. Bush fick en rapport som skrivits av Nader Bacchus. Rapporten preciserade Zarqawis roll i vågen av bombattentat.
I wrote a presidential daily brief based on intelligence that we had received that Zarqawi was responsible for some of the major initial attacks in 2003, that he was still there and that he was looking to foment civil war.
Informationen fördes vidare till vicepresidentens stabschef Louis Scooter Libby. Nader Bacchus satt vid sitt skrivbord på CIA när det ringde.
I received a phone call at my desk to my own line from Scooter Libby's office. To call an individual analyst is only about pressuring them. Intimidation. We write these anonymously when they go to the White House. Our names are not attached to the brief. And I immediately told them I couldn't discuss any of this and hung up.
Men vicepresidentens stabschef gav sig inte. Bacchus kallades till ett möte.
We were there because they wanted to figure out how they could poke holes in the analysis.
Frågorna kretsade kring Bacchus analys om ett uppror lett av Zarqawi.
There was a lot of consternation in the administration using the term insurgents because it would look as if the Iraqis weren't embracing what we were doing. Insurgency implies that they're fighting against us.
Certainly in the fall of 2003, the United States was in denial that an insurgency was brewing. In fact, that terminology was almost outlawed. No one could use it.
Den före detta vicepresidenten och hans stabschef har sagt nej till intervjuer i det här ämnet.
At least 35 people have been killed in a huge car bomb attack in Baghdad.
På grund av den amerikanska ledningens förnekelse av verkligheten kunde Zarqawi härja fritt.
I think the senior leadership of the Bush administration was slow to realize, A, that there was an insurgency, and B, that there was an evil genius behind it, and C, that that evil genius was Zarqawi.
Zarqawi skickade budskap till det amerikanska folket.
Zarqawi already had captured people's attention from the succession of suicide bombings. Now he cultivated a different means to do so. And with someone like Nicholas Berg, I think very tragically, he found exactly the kind of person he wanted. An American, a do-gooder, who was also Jewish.
Mannen i mitten är Zarqawi.
If you watch it really closely, it's a Zarqawi show. He's standing there, he's reading in his guttural voice, he's reading this document. Then he's finished reading, and I'll never forget this, he finishes reading and he just hands the script to an aide who kind of takes it. It was just like a CEO handing his briefcase to his aide, and then he pulls out the machete.
It's the only beheading video I've ever watched, the first and last, because it was so horrifying. You can hear all the noises of the poor man's death, and Zarqawi standing over the mutilated body delivering his message to the world.
The fact that Zarqawi was killing people personally made him far more appealing to the 20-something Sunni in Saudi Arabia or Iraq or even in Europe, the foreign fighter, the kind of guy that you want to go join if you're one of those young disaffected Sunnis.
Till sist vaknade Bush-administrationen och utlyste en belöning på $25 miljoner för tips som ledde amerikanerna till Zarqawi.
But it basically puts the same price on his head that Osama bin Laden has on his. And it basically elevates him now to enemy number one for the United States.
Osama bin Laden kunde inte längre ignorera Zarqawi.
It's shortly after that the relationship changes. Zarqawi is the new startup, and bin Laden wants to invest. He wants Zarqawi to use the Al-Qaeda brand. So since Al-Qaeda hadn't done anything since 9/11, this was a perfect opportunity for bin Laden to get back in the game.
För Zarqawi var det en stor seger. I ett brev till bin Laden som amerikanerna kommit över förklarade han sina planer. Han skrev: när det avgörande ögonblicket närmar sig utnyttjar vi landets säkerhetsvakuum.
What Zarqawi says in the letter is, we have one choice, and that is to start a sectarian war. And basically to set all of Iraq on fire, and to draw in the whole world.
Zarqawi fortsatte: om vi lyckas dra in dem i det sekteristiska kriget så kan vi väcka de passiva sunniterna.
We're going to foment a civil war, and this will cause the Shia to overreact. They are going to go after the minority Sunni population, and then the Sunnis are going to have to turn to us, the jihadists, to defend them.
Zarqawi gick till aktion. Han satte igång ett aldrig tidigare skådat våld mot shia-muslimerna.
12 هجوما بسيارات مفخخة هزت العراق. 170 people died in that weekend truck.
Daily life in Iraq, kidnappings and thousands of killings every
These killings have created a climate of fear.
وما تبقى من سيارة مفخخة تركت قرب مستشفى في مدينة الصدر الواقعة شمال شرقي
A wave of sectarian killing across Iraq left at least 9.
Zarqawi gavs ett nytt namn: massmördarnas sheik.
Once he pivoted to Shia, Baghdad was just hammered with huge car bombs, but also just daily assassinations of families, of neighbors. Then you started having those torture cells, the beheading videos. The invasion toppled the government, but Zarqawi ripped the country in half.
God, the horrible years in Iraq when there were, hundreds and hundreds of car bombs and suicide bombings. It was incredible what they did. I mean, it was murderous, it was psychopathic, it was horrific, but it was really extraordinary.
Osama bin Laden accepterade inte dödandet av muslimer. Hans närmaste man, Ayman as-Zawahiri, skrev i ett brev till Zarqawi: många av era muslimska beundrare undrar över era attacker på shiiterna. Frågornas skärpa ökar när ni attackerar en moské.
So the response from Al-Qaeda was, stop doing what you're doing. Killing Shia and other Muslims aren't going to achieve the objective that we need. This isn't the path that we want you to take, and we're telling you to stop.
Zawahiri fortsatte: min uppfattning är att det här aldrig kan uppskattas av den muslimska massan, hur mycket ni än försöker förklara.
170 people died in that weekend truck bombing of
Men Zarqawi höll inte med. Han ville provocera fram ett krig mellan sunniter och shiiter.
Attacks are constant and often grisly.
Han svarade på brevet med ett oerhört dåd. Han sprängde den shiitiska Gyllene moskén i Samarra.
Samarra was the straw that broke the camel's back for the sectarian war.
He just took down the biggest revered shrine in Iraq, and immediately, it was within 12 hours that everything in Iraq changed. I mean, it wasn't, it went from good to bad. It went from horrible to unbelievably horrible.
Inbördeskrig bröt ut. De döda räknades i tiotusental.
That set off a cycle of violence between Sunni and Shia that Al-Qaeda tried to fuel as much as they possibly could. Zarqawi directing it, of course, very capably.
Zarqawi achieved what he wanted to achieve. He had fomented anger and fear and frustration enough that populations felt pitted against each other.
När inbördeskriget rasade beslöt Zarqawi att för första gången visa sitt ansikte i en video.
He understood the power of the internet. It showed him using an American automatic weapon. Not necessarily using it correctly, but he did use it in a way that I think established his flair for publicity.
It's propaganda, it's recruitment, it shows what their intention is. He's wanting other people to join him. He's building his army at this point.
I videon förklarade Zarqawi att han skulle bilda en islamisk stat, det första steget mot ett globalt kalifat.
He was never content just to be the thug from Zarqa. And he wasn't content just to be the guy who beheaded Nick Berg. He wanted to rule a caliphate.
En islamisk stat hade aldrig varit aktuellt för bin Laden.
Al-Qaeda saw that time as a long way off, and Zarqawi was very, very much more impatient. You know, so this we can do now.
För Zarqawi var skapandet av kalifatet ett förverkligande av en profetia.
That religious vision promises the return of God's kingdom on earth, the reestablishment of the early Islamic empire, the empowerment of Sunni Muslims around the world, that the reestablished caliphate will eventually take over the entire globe, and then the entire world will come crashing to an end.
The lead aircraft is going to engage it here momentarily with a 500-pound bomb on the target.
Nästa video av Zarqawi blev mycket annorlunda. 2006 fick USA ett tips och Zarqawis gömställe bombades. Zarqawi var död, men hans plan för en islamisk stat levde vidare.
Zarqawi's death is a severe blow to Al-Qaeda. It's a victory in the global war on terror.
President Bush tog initiativet. Han gav order om en stor insats i Irak för att stoppa blodbadet.
The surge begins, but the president stands increasingly alone.
David Petraeus var befälhavare.
The priority had to be on securing the Iraqi population, and that this could only be done by living with the people. So we went back into the neighborhoods in Baghdad and other areas that were threatened by this ever-spiraling Sunni-Shia cycle of violence.
10, 20, 30, 40,000.
Med hjälp av flera $100 miljoner slöt Petraeus en allians med de sunnitiska stammar som hade samarbetat med Zarqawi.
The hierarchy in society, chopped off too many heads there, taken too many wives from the local population, had upset the power structures. Guys from the tribes started to turn against Al-Qaeda and looked to the US military for support.
En efter en dödades Zarqawis anhängare av amerikanska styrkor med hjälp av sunnitiska milismän.
Al-Qaeda in Iraq had been eviscerated. There are probably 37 individuals that survived that onslaught that we created in 07 and 08 that were really Al-Qaeda.
The definition of destruction is that you are rendered incapable of performing your mission without reconstitution. So they're flat on their face and they're down, and we had our boot on their neck.
Resten av Zarqawis grupp gick under jorden i 3 år. År 2009 blev kriget i Irak en ny presidents ansvar.
President Obama was elected on a promise to get the United States out of Iraq, and he was determined to do that.
Barack Obama berättade om sin plan inför tusentals marinsoldater.
I've come to speak to you about how the war in Iraq will end. The situation in Iraq has improved. Al-Qaeda in Iraq has been dealt a serious blow by our troops and Iraq's security forces.
Obama ville lämna Irak och gå vidare.
I intend to remove all U.S. troops from Iraq by the end of 2011.
Last U.S. troops are now leaving Iraq.
They're packing up and ready to hand over the remaining 2.
After almost 9 years of war and thousands of lives lost.
We disengaged not only militarily. At the end of 2011, we disengaged politically. The war was over. We were out. Let the chips fall where they may. Well, I don't think we thought through exactly how many chips were going to fall and what the consequences of that would be.
När amerikanerna var borta påbörjade Zarqawis grupp sin återuppbyggnad efter att ha hållit sig gömd i nordvästra Irak. De hade en ny ledare, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
I mean, he really is a chip off the old block in terms of Zarqawi. He has the same sort of sensibilities, the same flair for publicity, the same obsession with widespread violence.
They are part of a similar ideology. They believe in political Islam. They have a view of the caliphate. Baghdadi had a PhD, he was a soccer player.
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadis väg från religiös akademiker till IS-ledare inleddes i början av den amerikanska ockupationen. När den amerikanska armén slog till mot den sunnitiska befolkningen sattes Baghdadi i fängelse.
For a number of people who'd spent time in these jails, they spoke about them as jihadi training camps. So through being in jail together, people created new networks.
Fängelserna kallades jihad-universitet. Baghdadi lärde sig Zarqawis metoder.
He is able to network with other committed jihadists, capable jihadists that were attached to major organizations like Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And he begins to network with these men, many of whom he would rise with through the ranks of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, later the Islamic State.
Efter frigivningen befordrades Baghdadi inom Zarqawis organisation.
He very wisely played up the idea that his tribe had direct links to the Prophet Muhammad, and this was very important for establishing his legitimacy as a leader.
Baghdadi använde sin religiösa auktoritet för att rättfärdiga terrordåd.
ولا يمحى الهوان إلا ببذل النفوس والمهج ونضح الدم وبعثرة الأشلاء والجماجم.
En tid efter Zarqawis död var det Baghdadi som tog över makten.
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was much more assertive and much cleverer and much more ruthless than anyone had thought, and so was able to eliminate rivals, was able to get success, and success, of course, is a great attractor of support.
Baghdadi inriktade sig på att bygga en ny styrka och i likhet med Zarqawi var han ute efter att skapa kaos. Baghdadi hittade kaos på andra sidan gränsen i Syrien. Politisk oro rådde i landet.
It was an ideal set of circumstances for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi to capitalize on.
Demonstrationer mot president al-Assad hade mötts med våld.
There were peaceful demonstrations. These were put down violently, and that then sparked this cycle of violence.
När upproret växte skickade Baghdadi in hemliga agenter med uppgift att verka för inbördeskrig.
He wanted to establish the caliphate now. He wanted to take over towns, villages, and then cities. The border between Iraq and Syria could disappear if his organization controlled both sides of the border.
I Damaskus använde sig Baghdadi av Serkawis metoder för att markera sin närvaro.
I was sitting in my ambassador's residence in the upstairs den, reading when the 2 bombs went off. Immediately, from my time in Iraq, knew those are car bombs. That's not a normal sound here in Damascus.
Den amerikanska ambassadören Robert Ford skickade ut spanare till platsen.
Got a sense of how big the holes were and what had happened. The way the car bombs were delivered, crashing through gates with a follow-on car, was exactly what we had seen the Al-Qaeda organization do in Iraq. And so it had the fingerprints of Al-Qaeda.
The wave of car bombings that convulsed Damascus showed that tactics that had been successfully employed in Iraq had now been successfully exported to Syria.
Serkawis organisation hade inte bara överlevt, den växte i snabb takt.
2 back-to-back explosions hit the capital Damascus early on Friday. Authorities said at least 40 people were killed and more than 100.
På UD i Washington gav ambassadör Ford uttryck för sin oro. Han ville stödja vissa syriska rebellgrupper.
My team, working in our little offices and cubicles downstairs, began to think we would have to help those more moderate secular elements compete for recruits, otherwise they over time would be overwhelmed.
Beslutet måste tas i Vita huset. Ford hade 3 allierade i administrationen. CIA-chefen Petraeus, utrikesminister Clinton och försvarsminister Panetta. De informerade presidenten.
You did have people inside the administration who said, we need to get involved here. We need to help this opposition forces. We need to find those who represent values that we can live with and provide them arms and training.
The only way we were going to get credibility with those that were fighting on the streets and dying was to be able to provide the weapons they needed in order to confront Assad. And that's why I supported Petraeus's recommendations and why we recommended that.
Trots rådgivarnas rekommendationer sa Obama nej.
For us to think that somehow there is some simple solution, I think is a mistake.
That wasn't something President Obama wanted to do. He didn't think it would be effective. He didn't want to necessarily get involved in somebody else's civil war. He came to office not to get involved in the Middle East, but to get us out of the Middle East.
I Syrien fortsatte regeringsstyrkornas bombningar av de moderata rebellerna. Så kallade bombtunnor fälldes i städerna. I kvarter efter kvarter.
They wanted our help. You know, I think it's fair to say we didn't do much. We did almost nothing to help them. Therefore, they're gone. I mean, they're gone. They're finished. I mean, as a significant force, they're finished.
Ett knappt år senare ändrade sig Obama. Han beslöt att skicka lätta vapen till utvalda rebellgrupper, men det var för sent. Under tiden växte Baghdadis styrkor.
And the consequences are exactly what the CIA and the Pentagon and the State Department predicted, was that if the United States isn't shaping the opposition to Assad, radical Sunni groups that look a lot like Al-Qaeda will do that. And they did.
2013 erövrade Baghdadis styrkor hela regioner i Syrien.
The civil war in Syria gave him an opportunity. The civil war in Syria gave them a platform. Now it's not few dozens hiding in the western desert. Now there's thousands and thousands of foreign fighters that's coming from everywhere. 5,000 from Western Europe, 6,000 from Tunisia, almost 5,000 from the former Soviet Union. People coming from everywhere.
Baghdadi skapade det som Zarqawi hade lovat, en sorts stat. Han kallade den Islamiska staten. Högkvarteret placerades i Raqqa och IS bröt samtidigt med al-Qaida.
Al-Baghdadi's success in carving out this Islamic state and putting Raqqa as its centerpiece, as its capital, is a reflection, again, of a strategy that Zarqawi pursued.
IS styrde över sitt område med våld och skräck.
Or begin to slaughter your people on your streets.
I get a steady diet of these videos that they put out. So it's, you know, today they stoned to death a man for, you know, because they suspected him for being gay, or they stoned to death a woman, or they put a man in a car and exploded it, or they skinned somebody alive, or they crucified somebody, or they beheaded somebody every day.
I Washington försökte man utarbeta en lämplig strategi för Syrienfrågan. Den nya försvarsministern Chuck Hagel deltog i många möten och hoppades på en lösning.
In those meetings there were too many people there. I go into these meetings and every chair was filled in the situation room. You have 30 people in there sometimes. What were they doing in there? And everybody had a chance to talk. We rarely got to a conclusion or a decision, and too many people talking. And I think that always leads to an ineffective process.
President Obama var emot militär inblandning.
The notion that the way to solve every one of these problems is to deploy our military. That hasn't been true in the past, and it won't be true now.
IS-hotet verkade avlägset.
President Obama doesn't see this emerging group as an existential threat. He doesn't even see it as equivalent to al-Qaeda in any real way. Don't inflate these guys into something that they're not. Don't make them 8-foot giants.
Teamet bakom den här dokumentären bad Vita huset om en intervju. Svaret blev nej. I Raqqa smidde Baghdadi nya planer för IS expansion i Irak.
At this very time that al-Baghdadi is building his organization in Syria, the Baghdad government, the Shia government of al-Maliki, starts virtually assaulting the Sunni homeland.
Under åren efter det amerikanska uttåget hade Iraks shiitiske premiärminister Nouri al-Maliki diskriminerat sunniterna.
The Sunni Arab tribes in Iraq had become disillusioned with the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. So there was widespread disaffection among the tribes. They began to engage in a series of protests against the regime.
And these protests are violently crushed. And in such an environment, that enabled Islamic State of Iraq to rise up out of the ashes and saying, we will protect Sunnis from Maliki.
Det blev ett perfekt tillfälle för Baghdadi.
Where have the Sunnis to go? There's only one place they can go. It is that residual of the insurgency that is now run by al-Baghdadi.
I början av 2014 inledde Baghdadi en offensiv för att erövra Irak.
The Iraqi army, which was built at the incredible expense, I don't even know what the final price tag was, $30 billion. Largely by the Americans, paid for by the American taxpayer. You know, all their equipment, everything. It all came apart.
På mycket kort tid erövrade IS Fallujah, Ramadi och sen Iraks näst största stad, Mosul. Den 4 juli 2014 gick Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi upp för trapporna i Mosuls stora moské.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Baghdadi never shows his face, but the one occasion that he did was after the capture of Mosul.
He wasn't somebody hiding in a cave, somebody who never saw or released secret videos from unknown locations. He was in a mosque giving a speech and talking about the Islamic State.
Baghdadi förverkligade Zarqawis dröm. Han utnämnde sig till kalif. ledaren av det globala kalifatet.
Baghdadi addresses the assembled audience and proclaims himself the caliph and the ruler of Muslims worldwide. He proclaims the victory of Zarqawi's political project nearly a decade earlier. They now control a swath of territory containing some 5 million people. They have a war chest of some $2 billion. It's a remarkable success for an organization that was soundly defeated in 2009.
Baghdadi förvandlade Zarqawis vision till fasaväckande verklighet.
On the eve of 9/11 we have 400 pledged members, people who pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden. But now they have countries, they have armies, they have tanks, they have missiles, they have stuff that Osama bin Laden did not dream to have in his wildest dreams.
The United States of America is meeting them with strength and resolve. I ordered our military to take targeted action against
Under de 2 åren efter Baghdadis predikan har IS angripits av USA, Irak, Ryssland, Iran och flera andra nationer. IS har förlorat landområden men är numera verksamma över hela världen.
Inside the Parliament building, Canada's capital was stunned. Copenhagen, Denmark, a city in terror.
IS har utfört eller inspirerat till över 90 terrordåd i världen.
Multiple attacks have occurred in or around Paris.
De har minst 40 samverkande terroristgrupper i 16 länder.
The attack left at least 14 people dead and
De påstår att de bara har börjat.
From what investigators say was an ISIS suicide bomb attack in Turkey. Now, Belgian officials say 34 people were killed and 187 were wounded in 2 explosions.
And after today's horror, the question is, how many more terrorists are ready to strike?